Very good afternoon. Today's topic is a continuation of yesterday's. Yesterday was an introduction of the basic approaches to political thought, and today I will be taking up specific thinkers while I'm doing political philosophy or talking about political thought. So before I begin, I would like to speak about the meaning of political philosophy. What is political philosophy? Now, as we might have realized yesterday that the main obsession of political science is the state. So every thinker, every philosopher is obsessed about what is state, what is the nature of state, how did it originate, what are the political obligations in a state. Political obligation meaning the rights and duties. What are the laws that bind the state or limit the state? What is social justice and what is constitution? So if we talk about political philosophy, it would be imperative to discuss that the first major work on political philosophy was Plato's Republic. And then we had Aristotle's Politics, which was an empirical study of the political institutions. Like, he gave some very important concepts, like for him, democracy was a perverted form. And for today's world, if we realize, for him, polity was normal and perverted form was democracy. So it is quite a stark contrast to today's concepts, like where we think democracy is the best form of government. Then we also had thinkers which we will not be discussing, because these are mostly these are the thinkers which took into account religion also, and they are important from the law point of view. Thinkers like St. Augustine, whose book The City of God, it began the tradition of Christian political thinking. And further, it was developed by Thomas Aquinas, who gives various, in his book Summa Theologica, he talks about the hierarchy of laws and how the religion has a bearing on law, and how he categorizes law, and in that category, divine law is on the topmost of the hierarchy. And then furthering, when we start talking about states, the emergence of nation states, then we have a concept of territory, we talk about them having population, then sovereignty, and all these concepts, under the underlying cause of all the elements of state is the desire for power. Every state wants to be powerful in the international state of affairs. And then Niccolo Machiavelli, he studied the nature and limits of political power. So he in fact was the first political thinker who was talking about power. And then we had some of the contractualists who came, like thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Rousseau, who they expounded the social contract theory. So as we see, along all these stages, all the periods, all the era of political thinking, the main concern remained to be the following. First was the formation or the origin of state. How did the state begin? Second was, what was, once the state had been formulated, what was the role that it was performing? And whenever we analyze the nature or role of state, we always take two facts into consideration. What is the role of the individual and what is the role of the government or the state? Then we also take into consideration the form of government, what type of government exists. Then what if a country has a particular type of government, then what is the rationale for having that particular kind of government? Then we analyze, we always, all these political theories, they are concerned about what is the role of the individual, what is the role of, are they citizens or are they individuals? So the population per se is taken into account. Then what is the role of the ruler? Is the ruler absolute? Are there limitations on the ruler? Is he benevolent? Is he despot? So the role of the rulers become very important. And then it is also one of the concerns of all political thoughts to take into account the limitations. The limitations namely are the constitution. How does constitution impose a limit on the kind of government? How election is a consideration on limiting the government. How as we see in modern politics, that election tries to curtail the span of the government. If it is an unpopular government, it is a tool or an instrument that we have to limit the extent of government. And with recent international politics, it also is seen that public opinion is very important. You cannot ignore the voice of the people. So their opinion becomes very important. For example, I'll just give you an example. In the Vietnam War, the two countries were not a match. USA was much more powerful than Vietnam. But it was the public opinion within its own country that USA had to withdraw from Vietnam. So any political thinking also takes into account what the following limitations. And of course, in the recent years, it is public opinion which is taken into consideration. Now, if we talk about political philosophy, it would be worthwhile to mention the following thinkers. First is Machiavelli. Second is Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, George Hegel, Jeremy Bentham, and George Stuart Mill. And Karl Marx, of course, I will not be touching upon, but he is also an important socialist thinker. So now when we start with analyzing maybe the late medieval or the early modern period of political thinkers, it is most important to talk about Machiavelli. Now one thing is to be kept in mind, that there were two streams of thought. Being in India, we must also consider the Indian political thought. So there were two streams of thought that were developing. One was the Western political thought and the other was the Indian political thought. Western political thought, more of history, more period over which it spread. Then there were a lot of empirical research done, there were too much of data analysis, and it was more scientific. Indian political thought, on the other hand, it had a lesser span, in the sense that when we started theorizing it, we had a smaller span of history. And then it was not so scientific. It was more like, at times, it appeared like this, we were narrating an epic, or for example, Shanti Parv of Mahabharata. So it is more like a narrative, or we're talking about a story. So, but nonetheless, the underlying principles of Indian political thought cannot be ignored. Some of the contributions are very, very important. I will be looking up the theories or the thought of Kautilya, and then we realize how in 300 BC what he says is relevant even in the modern times. Now, talking about Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527, he was the first of the modern political thinkers. And according to Lasky, he was the product of Renaissance, because that was the time Italy was turbulent. And during this period of turbulence, it was Machiavelli who developed a pragmatic view. But the most important thing about Machiavelli was that he sanctioned the use of deception and force. And at times, he is also called the pioneer in political sociology. And he was one important follower of Montesquieu, because he also talks about separation of power. He did not believe, although he talks about power, but he does not believe in concentration of power. He also talks about separating the power. His main works are The Prince and Discourses. And the most important thing that he says, that although he is obsessed with power and the use of power, but he says that for a ruler to be successful, the ruler must be good and just. Now, if we look at his book, The Discourse, Machiavelli's true republican feelings are seen in discourse. You know, republican, then when we have an elected government. So, if we analyze Machiavelli, we realize that he is talking about power. Nonetheless, he doesn't talk about usurping power by illegal means. He talks about a republican form of government. So, the leader or the ruler is an elected ruler. So, he talks about two forms of republican government. Viver Sercuro, where the main focus is the security provided by a strong government but restricted by laws. So, although the government is very strong, very powerful, but there is a limitation, and these limitations are in the nature of laws. And the second type of republican government that Machiavelli talks about is Viver Libero. The main focus here is the freedom created by active participation and contention between rich and poor. He talks about he says that there are dichotomies in the society. There are certain people who are rich, there are people who are poor. But a good government, an active government emerges only when there is a contention and there is active participation and engaging both people from both the sections, from the rich section of the society and the poor section of the society. So if we try to look at Machiavelli, we come out with the following precepts. He says that no moral issue with ruling. Whoever has power and legitimacy can rule. His very important fact that he always underlines is power along with legitimacy. So he doesn't believe in naked use of power. And then he goes on to say there cannot be good laws without good arms. So that a king has to be benevolent to be dishing out good laws. And another important fact that he states is fear is better than affection. And it is better to be feared than loved. So he says to revere somebody, that person you have to be fearing that person. And only affection is no good. Fear is better than affection. And we obey out of fear of the state's power or its use of that power. It's not for any other reason. We don't love our state. We respect or we obey the state because we are scared of the power that the state may wield. So it is out of the use of power that the state entails obedience. So the state extracts obedience from the people because it can use power to put them right. Then when we were talking about power and the role of the state, and we're talking about use of power and where state is more powerful, definitely. If we analyze Machiavelli, somewhere down the line, Machiavelli says that state is very important, although he says that it is an elected state, elected government, and that state is not only using power nakedly, it is legitimate in using that power. Then what happens is that then we had different kind of thinking emerging in the state, and then we had lot of activities going on in Europe particularly, and in this age then we have emergence of the era of contractualists. Now these contractualists are these are the triad of thinkers, Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, who believe that the origin or the emergence or the formation of state is on the basis of contract that is signed between the people and the ruler. Now these contractualists, they talk about three stages. They say that in the beginning there is a state of nature which is very chaotic. At times it could be good, it could be peaceful, but there is a kind of lawlessness in that state of nature. So what we do is we form a kind of a contract. A contract is an agreement that we sign so that we come out of the lawlessness, people become happy, good life. This was Aristotle's concern. So the state has to ensure good life for the people, and for people to have good life they should come out of lawlessness and anarchy, and for this then we sign an agreement. So the people, they give certain things to the ruler, who in return comes and protects their life, liberty and property. So it is a two-way relationship. It's a give and take. So on the one hand there are the people who want certain things from the rulers, and there are rulers who in turn provide this protection, but they require something in return. And that return, it could be something like maybe taxation or obedience or certain duties towards the state. So this is the return that the state is seeking. And then when we have this agreement in the state of nature, then we have the emergence of civil society. The civil society is where there is peace, there is law, there are laws to govern the relationship between the state and the individuals, and there is less of lawlessness, there is no anarchy, people are happy and they can seek the goal of a good life. So in this triad of thinkers, we talk about Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes was born at the time the Spanish Armada was coming. So he often used to say, fear and I were born together, or fear and I were born twins. Now when he was born, because of the situation that was prevailing in the country, he was a Puritan. That is, he believed in the royal control of power. So he was a royalist, and he talked about absolute monarchy. The kings had absolute power. The people, so when he talks about the formation of a civil society, he says that state of nature, each of us had certain right or license to everything in the world. But he says that he paints a gloomy picture of the state of nature. He says that state of nature is not a very happy situation. There is darkness, there is depression, because people are by and large, they are not good. They are brutish, nasty, short. These are the terms that he used for the human nature. And he says that everybody is fighting with everybody, because the concept of property, mine and thine, is emerging. They want to have control over certain things, and when they want to have control, how do they have control? So they have to use force. So everybody is after the life of the other person. And his main work, Leviathan, which was written in 1651, it has incorporated all his political thoughts and ideologies. So as I told you, Hobbes describes the man in state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. So totally dark picture of mankind. It is, he is not positive about, he has no faith in human behavior. But the good thing is that he describes all men as equal with two driving forces. There are two desires in people. One is a love of survival. They want to live, right to life. And a sense of rationality, that is, they want to think because they realize that not thinking has landed up them in such a situation. So there are two things that they want. One is right to life and a sense of rationality. So with their goals, now people, what they do is they start working towards achieving a civil society. So what do? So they sign a contract with the king, which Hobbes calls the Leviathan. So this contract that they are signing is a one-way agreement. The Leviathan or the sovereign is not a party to that contract. So the problem is that the king is not a party, so he's not bound by the terms and conditions of the contract. So in a way it is a one-way contract in which only people have to do give and take, and the Leviathan is not bound by the terms, and he is not limited by this contract. So what happens as a result? The state is given a monopoly on violence and absolute authority. But there is a promise, there is an underlying agreement that a state of peace would be achieved, and power would be used only to punish the deviants and not naked use of power. It would not be used against everyone. Only power would be used against those who deviate from the laws. And because the state gets its power from the people and therefore must not abuse that power. This again, they say that the source of power are the people. So you cannot just use this power against the people. There are no guarantees, but if the state does abuse the power, it must be ready for the consequences. There are no guarantees. There are no laws in which you can say that there are no constitutional limitations, because he is an unlimited monarch. But nonetheless, either it is the morality, the principle of morality, or it is the fear of the divine, that the ruler, he does not use power just at his whim and fancy. He says that I have to use power judiciously, because if I do not use power judiciously, I must be ready to face the consequences. Although the thing is that there is no constitutional guarantee, there is no concept of overthrowing. And the government is important, but it doesn't, he says that there has to be, everybody can't be ruling. You have to have somebody who represent the people, and these are the people who are ruling. But it doesn't matter what form it takes. So the government could be any form, so long as it is ruling properly. Law is completely dependent on power. Justice is whatever the law says it is. There is no unjust law. There is no unjust law because they believe that the sovereign is an agent of God. He has divine origin. And because he is an agent of God, what he says are things which have divine backing. And therefore, all these are just laws, and there is no concept of unjust law. So, when Then after Hobbes, the concept of Hobbesian state that we have, it is a kind of lawlessness, there is absolute despotism, the monarch is absolute. Then we had a second breed of thinker called John Locke. And John Locke, he can be said to be or considered to be a liberal thinker. And all modern nation states, especially the US, the UK, owe their genesis to the Lockean theory. So there is a drastic change, whereas Hobbes was I'm going to compare the three thinkers towards the end of the Contractualist. But now what I want to say is that Locke says that people are rational. There are right to life, liberty and property. These are the three natural laws that people had. And because people had brought the sovereign to power, they could revolt against bad leaders. Supposing they had made a bad choice, they did not have to bear with that bad choice. They could do away with these bad leaders. Now, in a natural state, that is, a state of nature, all people were equal and independent. None had the right to harm another's life, health, liberty or property. So, clearly then we had emergence of three kinds of right to life, liberty and property. The concept of property became the cause of quarrel further on. Although the quarrel also started with property, it got aggravated with property, and later on when we look at Adam Smith and all, many of the thinkers, political thinkers, they are talking in terms of property. Property or wealth, for example, Karl Marx also does that. Now, his book, the famous work of Locke, Two Treatises of Government, 1689, he talks about state of nature, and then we have signing of a contract. And about the contract, Locke says that in a just and fair society, men and government have two types of social contract. So there is not one, but two types of contract. One he calls the social contract, and the other he calls the governmental contract. The social contract is between the men. So each man signs a contract with another one, having duties and responsibilities to each other. So this is called the social contract. This resulted in the formation of society. Now, let us keep in mind that all these state of nature that Hobbes or Locke talk about, they talk about pre-political states. They don't talk about pre-social states, because the moment humanity began, we had a social organization, at least called family. So whatever they're talking is pre-political and not pre-social. So the first kind of contract, social contract, led to the emergence of the civil society, and the second kind of contract led to the emergence of the government. Now, furthering on the Locke's hypothesis, he says that God created man and set the goal of survival. So you had right to life. Now, how to better that life? How to have good life? So you had to have liberty and you had to have property to better the life. So the two natural rights came as a logical consequence of the right to life. Now, with this goal, whatever means are necessary to achieve that goal are allowed. So we have a goal, and that goal is survival, and not only survival with a quality of life. So in attaining that goal, I can use whatever means I feel like to achieve that goal, but I feel like, whatever goals that are allowed, because we talk about certain limitations. Now Locke argues that man has no liberty to destroy himself. The first thing that Hobbes talks about, when we said that people were after each other's life, so his only obsession was self-preservation. So I have to protect my life, and for that I needed, the most important right that I needed was the right to life. But Locke says that I don't have the right to destroy any other person. Therefore, murder and suicide are not allowed by nature. I also do not have the right to usurp other person's property. So my property is to be guarded, and for this I needed right to property. I had certain liberty in the society. I had to be free, I had to have free movement, and for all this then I needed the right to liberty. So these are the three natural rights which were allowed in the society. Now, Locke goes on to say that God gave man the world to use, and therefore it is ours. So, the world is ours, and how to make that world a better place is also therefore our responsibility. Private property is needed to survive. But Locke's view is that no one should have more than he can use, or more than labor can improve. See, there are certain resources which are already there. So what is the need of the hour is that using our labor, we better those resources and make them consumable. So Locke says that he wants to put a limit on the property. It is not a mad race. We have to use only that so much that we require. And the second condition is that we do not require more than we can work on. We can invest our labor on. So because this is an inherent problem, because Locke talks about property, so he also lays the basis of degeneration of society, because with the introduction of money, inequality is created, and then it is then when you need a repressive or a firm government which can control and which can distribute property. Now, in the beginning, Locke, he talks about two kinds of contracts, social contract and the governmental contract. So as a result of the governmental contract, we have the emergence of the government. The government, according to Locke, is legitimate if it protects its citizens' right to life, liberty, and he also adds health and property, because according to Locke, health is very important to us to provide good life. A government is legitimate if it does not, it is legitimate if it protects these rights, and if it does not, it is illegitimate, and therefore it has no reason to stay. An illegitimate government can and must be rebelled against. So he gives the people the right to revolt, and the reason for the right to revolt being granted is because people have formed the government, therefore they have the right to remove the government. That's the concept that we have in the modern days, hire and fire. If I have hired somebody, I have a reason to fire that person. And then in the process, you do not have to bear with a bad government. If the government is illegitimate, if it is not using power, property, if it is not redistributing wealth appropriately, then it has to go, and in its place a new legitimate government must be created. And who creates the government? It is the people. Now in between, just digressing from contractualist, because periodization is also important. So just a slight digression from the contractualists. I would like to talk about Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755. He was born in France into wealth. He was born in a rich family, and he was born in the period of Louis XIV, and France that time had very difficult situations. People were not very happy, and he happened to be going to England. When he goes to England, he sees the kind of liberty that the people enjoy there. He comes back and he talks about liberty being granted to people. And how do you give individual liberty? Because Louis used to say, I am the state. His famous saying was, I am the state. So a person is synonymous with the state, entire state. So this kind of a thinking had to be done away with. And when he comes back from England, he starts writing. Spirit of Laws is the book that he had written, but it was not appreciated because obviously the king would not like a thinker criticizing his style of governance. So he comes back and he says that for individual liberty to be enjoyed, and for tyrannical laws not to be executed, and for the judiciary not to be adjudicating laws that it itself made, we had to separate the powers of the government. So he talks about types of governments in one place. He talks about republic, democracy, and aristocracy. Aristocracy, if it's a noble ruler, noble monarch, then aristocracy is a good form of government. He talks about republic, where the head is elected. He talks about democracy, where people have a choice in making the government, and also there are options available to people while making those choices. And then he goes on to say that the best form of government is one where there is separation of power. By separation of power, he means the governance should be separated into three organs. He talks about, in fact, two kinds of separation. One, he talks on the spatial level. He talks about territorial separation of power. Territorial separation of power is when an entire state is divided into states or provinces or Länder in Germany. So this is called spatial or territorial separation of power. That is, there is no unitary government where power is concentrated. And the second way in which power could be separated is functional separation of power. And this functional separation of power is done by forming three organs of the government. A first organ which forms the laws, which are the basis of any governance, is the legislature. The second organ which executes these laws became the executive. And the third one, which adjudicated in case of conflicts, was the judiciary. So it was important that no person occupied the same position. At the same time occupied two positions or three positions. So every unit of organ of power was compartmentalized. You had separate compartments. But sooner or later Montesquieu realized that absolute separation of power was not possible. And he talks about there are certain extents in which they start intermingling. And you cannot have watertight compartments. And this is when he, towards the end of his career, he goes on to say that absolute separation of power is not possible. So there are certain fusion or intermingling that we must allow. And later on, James Madison, the father of the US Constitution, he takes up this argument and he devises a system of checks and balances. Checks and balances, as we know, are the systems of areas of overlap between two organs of government, or maybe there are certain areas where all the three of them overlap, and these are called, for example, like a concept like judicial review. So any act of legislature is open to scrutiny by the judiciary through the power called judicial review. So the legislative power is not isolated, it doesn't have a watertight boundary, but there are certain pores, and this pore is called judicial review. Now, when Montesquieu talks about separation of power, not all countries adopt this separation of power, because a lot of countries, they feel that separating power is not possible. So let us be more practical. So countries like UK, for example, they adopted the parliamentary system of government, the chief characteristic of which is fusion of power. So you have all the organs interacting in the formation of government, but by and large they have distinct roles to perform. So India, for example, has borrowed the principle of parliamentary government from UK, and it practices the concept of fusion of power. So then the essence of Montesquieu's argument is that the state is all about the use of power and governance, and for the best governance the power must be separated. Every act of the government must be performed by a different organ. Then just coming back to our contractualists, so we must not forget the role of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His main work was The Social Contract, which he wrote in 1762. And interesting thing is that he has nothing new to say except the concept of general will. What he does is he takes a point here, he takes a point from here and there, mainly from Hobbes and Locke, and blends them and gives out his theory of social contract. But his contribution cannot be belittled because he is the intellectual father of the French Revolution. His most important point is that he talks about a contract where each person signs a contract with all, and all the people sign contract with each other. So you have a mesh, each with all and all with each. So it is people who become very important. There is absolute liberty to people. And there is a new concept that he talks about. He says it is not important that power be vested in one single person, because he is not a true representative. He talks about people's power, and he says that let us have a pool, everybody put their interest together, and then this common pool of multitude of options and multitude of desires and wishes he calls the general will. And this is the creative idea or novel idea which Rousseau gives. So he could be said to be the precursor or the progenitor of the concept of popular sovereignty, people's power. So what people did was they transferred all their rights to a collective pool. And when we blended all these, what came out was the general will. And this general will was very unique because it wasn't any person's selfish interest. It was the will of the entire society. So nobody could say that the interests of the society have been left behind. But the one problem was that sovereignty was it was not a definite as concept. You could not pinpoint, yes, this is the person who is the ruler. This is a person in which the sovereignty is concentrated. It was an abstract concept because you had a pool in which there were multitude of individuals. So to locate sovereignty or to locate the pole of power became very problematic. Now, as I told you earlier, that Rousseau said nothing unique. He combined the elements of both Hobbesian and Lockean theory. And just the timing was very important. What time he gave out his theory became very important. And then we must not forget his most famous maxim that man is born free, yet everywhere we see him in chains. And this is why he says that although we are born free, but then there are limitations at every stage. We always have to face, don't do this, don't do this. So although we are born free, but we have to be bound by certain limitations. So for him, limitations were very important. So now if we look at the contractualist thinkers, we have to look at these aspects. Now if we try to summarize all the three thinkers, and I would like to have a look at this table that has been prepared. We describe Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. If we look at their concept, how they describe the man, what is the nature of man. So Hobbes paints a very dark picture. He talks about man as being nasty, brutish and short. Whereas Locke, he's more optimistic. He says man is peace-loving, he's social and rational. And Rousseau talks about him as being noble savage. One desire of Rousseau was because he believed in the simplicity of the old and he had faith in the simplicity of the state of nature. He wanted to go back to the state of nature, and that is why probably he wants to retain the term savage. So noble savage, although he was savage, but he was a noble savage. Now, taking into the second aspect, why did the state of nature degenerate? Although to begin with it was a happy and peace-loving point, but what was the cause of conflict in the state of nature? So for Hobbes, it was only the self-preservation. People were after each other's life. So to protect one's life, a contract was essential. For Locke, the cause of conflict was absence of judge. There was nobody to judge or adjudicate, and people did not have reason. And for Rousseau, the cause of conflict, incidentally, is dawn of reason. Even absence of reason is a cause of conflict. Dawn of reason is also a cause of conflict, because then you become very, very skeptical. You try to look at the bad side of everything. And the second cause of conflict was increase of population. The population was increasing. And then we had the signing of the contract. So what is the nature of the contract? So Hobbes says there is only one contract, a social contract. Sovereign is not a party to that contract. This is one of the criticisms leveled against this. Then Locke talks about two types of contract. One is a social contract and the second is a governmental contract. And the sovereign is very much a party to the contract. And Rousseau, on the other hand, he talks about a contract which is people's contract, each with all and all with each. Now, as a result of this contract, then we had the emergence of a government. So what is the nature of sovereign according to Hobbes? Hobbes talks about absolute monarchy, and the absolute monarch he calls Leviathan, and this is incidentally the name of his book also. Now Locke talks about limited monarchy. He says there has to be limitations, and he talks about a limited government, constitutional limitations. Limitation of choosing a legitimate ruler when the incumbent becomes illegitimate. Whereas Rousseau says that the sovereignty rests with the people. It is not one person who is important. It is the entire general will of the people which is important. In a way, he is talking about democracy because not everyone can, all of us can rule. So he talks about representative democracy. The will of the people are represented by a small group of people, and this is democracy. Now, what is people's right? According to Hobbes, liberty was a gift by rulers. So the ruler always said that people should be obliged to him because whatever liberty that they have it is my gift to you, because people only had the right to life in Hobbesian state. Now Locke, on the other hand, talks about people's right. He talks about natural rights of life, liberty and property. So according to him, all these rights of life, liberty and property are there. These are natural rights. The state had not given those rights, so it could not take away those rights. The only right that the state had was to interpret those rights. Again with Rousseau also, it was the same case. The rights had not been created by the state could not take away the rights, and the state only had the right to interpret. Then what happened if we had somebody who was unpopular, somebody who was using power illegitimately, and he came to power? Then did the people have the right to revolt? For Hobbes, the right to revolt was totally absent. Locke said that right to revolt had to be given to people because the government was a trust created by the people. And according to Rousseau also, the right to revolt was very much present because it was the government was a will of the people. It was by the people, so the people could take away the government whenever they were not happy with the government. So the outcome of the contractualist debate was that the state is an outcome of a social contract, and the social contract transforms the state of nature into a civilized society. And then based on the role and the function that the state performs, we have the emergence of different kinds of state. These are called forms of state. So is it a liberal state? Is it an idealist state? Is it an individualist state? So all these depend on the role that the state thus formed out of the contract takes up. So the role that is taken up also is one of the concerns of the study of political thought. Now, I'm just touching upon the very modern thinkers. We talk about Hegel's philosophy of right. He defends private property, and he stimulated Karl Marx. Karl Marx always used to base his theories on Hegel's concepts. In fact, he talks about contradictions in society, and this is the concept dialecticism. So society progresses through dialectics is one of the concepts which was given by Hegel, and Karl Marx then started basing his theory on this. Then we come to John Stuart Mill, who was a modern liberalist, and he developed Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian theory of law and political institutions so as to reconcile them with individual liberty. And then we had after the Cold War, until the end of Cold War, then we had right-leaning liberals like John Rawls and Robert Nozick who came, and they had point of differences between the right and the left wing. Then they disagreed with some of the traditional liberal thinkers as well. But I would not be touching upon the very modern political thinkers. And there were then three new aspects at least which were coming into the domain of political thinking. So political thought, apart from liberalism, individualism, idealism, had new challenges now. And these three challenges, important challenges, were feminism, multiculturalism and terrorism in the recent years. Talking about the function that the state performs. So there are two aspects of a state, the individuals and the state or the ruler. So how much of interference is there between the two of them? Based on that, we have the role of the state or the function of the state. So if we talk about individuals being more important, then this is an individualist state. But if we talk about not only about individuals, we also talk about societies, then we have what is called a liberalist state. Now if we give more importance to state, then what emerges, the form that the state takes, is called an idealist state. So if we talk about George Hegel, he is an extreme idealist, because according to him, state is infallible, can never make mistakes, it is omnipotent, and it is divine. And the moment if you assign a element of divinity to state, then most of the time the question of questioning the state becomes very difficult, because it has an element of divinity, and a lot of people, for fear of divine punishment, will not question. And very importantly, Hegel had no respect for individuals' existence. He used to say that individuals have no existence outside the state. Now, if you did not belong to a state, you were no citizen, you were no individual at all. So much so that he even said that state is march of God on earth. So this is about idealism, that state is very important and everything belongs to the state, and individuals only have function and they have importance so long as they serve the state. Now in all this, while all this was going on, we had Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, who, although was a French sociologist, but his major contribution was to democratization in America. And he used to say America is very different to Europe. And he was concerned with the civic dimensions of democracy. He talked about individualism, about equality and a balance of power. And he was the first one of the modern thinkers who talks about, although Rousseau does talk about general will, but he doesn't coin the concept popular sovereignty. Tocqueville talks about popular sovereignty. He says that people are very important, more so in a democracy, because they make the choice, they choose the ruler, and the rulers are there on their behalf. They are agents of the people. So money making is dominant ethics in America. He says that the ethics of people are also very different. So that is the reason why he says America is very different to Europe, because ethically also the two continents are very different. Democratic values which championed money making, hard work and individualism reigned. So he says it is very, very pragmatic democracy. You only value those facts, those qualities which let you make money, and where they make you more important as an individual and not as part of the state. Then when Tocqueville talks about democracy, then we have J.S. Mill, who talks about liberty. And his earlier contribution, he could be said to be the last of the utilitarians, because when he talks about modern liberalism, he doesn't say that individuals are very, very important. He says that state is also important. State also has certain roles to perform, and we cannot do away without state. Now, the importance of J.S. Mill is stated in his main work, which is called On Liberty, and he talks about a representative government. He says that a representative government is the one who can grant individual liberty. So because it has been, it represents the interest of the individuals. And for governance, he says that not everybody is competent to govern. It is a task which requires certain expertise. So you have to be educated before you start governing. And he talks about participation and equality. He talks about participation of people in the election process, but he does not allow franchise to everyone. Franchise is limited. He talks about limited franchise. He also is one of the first feminist thinkers. He talks about feminism. He talks about the right of women. Then, as I told you, whatever Mill had to say was an improvisation upon Bentham. Bentham was the last of the utilitarianism. And utilitarianism as a concept talks about greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now, one thing is very tactful here. Bentham talks about greatest happiness of the greatest number, because he feels that extreme happiness, all the entire happiness for all the people is never possible. So he qualifies his statement. He says greatest good of the greatest number. And how can you achieve greatest happiness of the greatest number? That can be done through minimal government, by allowing people to have free market economy and allowing state only very selective intervention, and that too only in the welfare activities. So he was very, very clear. Let people be free, but when it comes to social welfare, the state must come in. Now, if we look at the modern times, political thoughts and international relations, how does political thinking contribute to international relations? And the most important contribution of political thought is in the realm of realism. Now, realism is a diverse and complex mode of political and ethical theorizing. Rather than, it is not a value neutral branch at all. It is not about national interest, it is more than national interest. And because when we talk about state in international politics, any state in international politics is based on the Hobbesian concept of power. That is, it is only the conflict for power, it is the craze for power, it is the drive for power, desire for power, which shapes international relations. And if we look at the modern international political thinkers, then we cannot avoid taking the names of some of the realists, including Hans Morgenthau, E. H. Carr, and Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, other views also, they also keep writing about the impact of medieval political thinking or ancient political thinking on international relations. And Hannah Arendt is a very important person whose writings reflect the views of the medieval liberalist thinkers. Now, the relationship between power and ethics, how much of use of power is legitimate, what is illegitimate, what is naked use of power, what is the difference between power and authority. All these are normative political concepts, and what constitutes political reality is again based on the medieval political thinking. For example, as I was telling you, that if we talk about political thinkers, then the right to life, liberty, property, and property, the right to property became very important. It became the basis of the state in the later times. And I would just like to take up one thinker, Adam Smith. I'm not taking up Karl Marx. Now, Adam Smith proposed that the government should adopt a laissez-faire attitude towards the economy, free market, while appearing chaotic. It appears chaotic and unrestrained if you let markets be free. It is actually guided to produce the right amount and variety of goods by a so-called invisible hand. And whose invisible hand? So all these principles he lays down in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Touching upon Indian political thought, just a bit of Indian political thought. I will just take up Kautilya, who was the political advisor of Chandragupta. And his main work, Arthashastra, which was written 300 BC, is still relevant today. If you look at his theories, look at his concepts, they still hold good. For example, the means by which a state is established. He says that the ends are more important and not the means. So a king can come to power, but once he comes to power, then the goals that he has to achieve have to be important, and they have to be just and honest. Now, he says that the state has to be established because in the absence of an authority, there was Matsya Nyaya, big fish eating the small fish. So, for that, the state had to come into existence. Once the state comes into existence, he doesn't talk about 3 organs, he talks about 7 organs of the state, Saptang theory. And the 7 organs, he says that these are organically linked. They are like parts of a chariot, and without any part the chariot would not move. So he lays down the 7 angs. He begins with Swami, Mantri, and when he talks about a hierarchy of the 7 angas or prakrits that he calls, he says that each anga, it is important to have the hierarchy in mind because each anga is superior to the one below it in the hierarchy. For example, Swami is more important than Mantri. Now, when he was giving his theory of state, he said that it is territorial protection and conquest were very important. And he talks about Janpad, he talks about Durg, he talks about Bal, Ashtang Bal also, he talks about contingency force. So all these are very, very relevant terms even today. He talks about a well-defined taxation system. The progressive taxation system that we have in India today is a borrowing from Kautilya. He talked about less taxation for agriculture, and we follow the same principle now. he gave a comprehensive list of taxable items, and luxurious items, luxurious activities, things like gambling and prostitution, he said should be taxed more. So this is the kind of approach that we even have now in the present taxation system. Then when we talk about foreign relations, his Mandela theory cannot be ignored. He talks about friend's enemy, enemy's friend is a friend. So this is how he tried to say that international relations, when you make relations, you should base your concepts on these. The kind of diplomacy that he gives out in his Mandel theory, the wide network of espionage or the spy system that he says are very, very contemporary, and it is in fact appalling to see that a person talking in 300 BC and those concepts still relevant today. Now he is at times compared to Machiavelli also, because the style of statecraft that he says that using deceit and intrigue is fair if you are trying to govern. So now because the time doesn't permit, I would try to wrap up my session on political thought. I have done with the forms of state, that is the nature of state, and what is the function of the state. And then I went on to touch upon briefly upon the Indian political thought, and I told you why Indian political thought is not much read because of the certain limitations that I had earlier pointed out. So in conclusion, if you analyze all the thinking, all the theories, all the thinkers, there are certain common elements that run through all. One is the element of relativity, that is the meaning of freedom changes for every thinker, but the essence is that all of them talk about individual freedom. There is an element of continuity and change. One person may be talking about an ideal state, the other person may be talking about individualism, but there is an element of continuity because the basic role, the basic assumption is that state is required, you cannot do away with state. Then any thinking that you see, you have to look at it in the context of the time that it evolved. You have to look at the circumstances in which this particular theory evolved. It reflects the circumstances and the time in which it was written. Then every aspect has a bearing on another. Example, if you have freedom, then you will have democracy. If you have democracy, then you would have individual liberty. So it is like a cyclical relationship. Every aspect is interlinked to another. So much so that Sabine says that individualism of all thinkers from Locke to Mill is based on interests of the class that produced it, less on logic. So Sabine, he made a cutting remark. He said that it is not the class interest that they are looking at, or they are not looking at the general interest or logic. They are looking at their own interest when they are writing the political thoughts. Thank you.